Guardians of the Galaxy was developed by Eidos Montreal, the caretakers of the modern incarnation of the Deus Ex franchise, a series that I've been dying to do a few videos on, and published by Square Enix, and that association with Square Enix really didn't do this game a whole lot of favors perception-wise, coming off the heels of the colossal letdown that was Marvel's Avengers. A lot of casual and uninformed gamers quickly assumed that these were the same people behind that game, and didn't have their hopes up for this one, not realizing that Eidos Montreal merely assisted with development and wasn't the main developer for that game. A quick look at Eidos' track record would tell you that these folks have developed a solid reputation for themselves, especially since their time downing the new direction for the Deus Ex franchise, which has netted them both the appreciation and approval of the Deus Ex fans of old while also creating new ones. They've also shown that they can take the brunt and weight that comes with handling a revered property and deliver too, and that's exactly what they've managed to do with Guardians of the Galaxy. I'll admit, I'm not a terribly big fan of the Guardians, and don't really know too much about them outside of what I've seen in films, so generally speaking I wasn't overly excited about the announcement of this game, especially since I've been really hoping that the game that we would see would be the conclusion to the Jensen trilogy, so to figure out that after all this time the game that Eidos was working on was a Guardians game, well, I was a little disappointed to say the least. Then there was gameplay shown off, and the fact that in this game you only play as Peter Quill, with the other Guardians merely assisting. And, well, I was feeling a little underwhelmed about it all, and this is someone who should really be on board with everything about this game. The entire aesthetic for this game should appeal to me. 80s music, space, superhero game, but it wasn't clicking. The reason I mention all of this is because, much like the Guardians themselves, this game was a massive underdog, really needing to impress me to shake those disapproving cobwebs off, and that's exactly what the game has done. If you haven't given the game a shot, do yourself a favor and do so. It is more than worthy of your purchase, as we'll break it down here. I still want another Deus Ex game, but now, I also want another Guardians game. Also, shout out to the numerous Deus Ex references in this game. As a massive fan, I really appreciate the nods, and it's nice to know that you haven't forgotten about Jensen. 0451 gang. By leaps and bounds, the biggest strength to the Guardians game is its narrative. The way the game is structured is that this motley crew is very much a recent thing, only having been a full group for what seems like a short while. There's a lot of distrust within the ranks, particularly with Gamora and Drax due to their link with Thanos, and a lack of faith overall in the team with Peter Quill's leadership skills. Though there are some major galaxy-threatening events that happen in this game, due entirely to the Guardians' quest for credits and reputation building, the crux of the story really comes down to acceptance, conquering your fears, and learning how to process your grief, and it's handled so beautifully in this game. There are genuinely a lot of moments that nearly activated the waterworks from yours truly, and that's in large part due to the stellar writing and absolute amazing performances from the entire Guardians cast. Every moment in the story feels earned, and when the team finally starts to come together, you feel it. You feel like you've also journeyed with them into being somewhat of an unofficial Guardian yourself, and you can't help but root for them when some of the more guarded members of the team finally start opening up, and the game really hammers that home with specific character unlocks when these moments of character growth happen, making those moments even more impactful. I can't say enough good things about this cast and writing though. There are way too many names to list for just standout performances, but John McLaren as Star-Lord, Kimberly Sue Murray as Gamora, Jason Cavalier as Drax, Alex Weiner as Rocket, and Adam Harrington as Groot all nail their respective roles and can really flip on those emotional beats for these characters when the story calls for it. And there are some other members of the cast that I can't mention out of fear of spoilers for those who care about that thing that also deserve their praise, but just know that they're absolute gold. I'll leave it at that. The game also takes inspiration from games like Mass Effect and Deus Ex, of course, with some narrative choices that you as the player get to make throughout the story, each affecting the story in different ways, and while this doesn't feel like it majorly impacts the story like, say, some of the aforementioned games, it does enough to offer enough of a variety to have you go through countless playthroughs to see how each scenario plays out differently, some being easier due to choices made and others being more difficult. Eidos has also really been good at the show-don't-tell storytelling, and they use it to great effect here to give more life to these characters, while also adding in humor, particularly with Drax. I mean, just look at this guy. This massive Catathian man reading a book about sarcasm while wearing these tiny glasses is just hilarious. But they also expertly use the inverse tell-don't-show during the slower sections, where you're usually exploring levels like Seknarf 9 or Nowhere and many others for goodies like costume unlocks for each individual Guardian, all of which can be earned in-game with no microtransactions here. These sections are fleshed out with character interactions that give you more context to the lives these characters were living prior to joining the team, and there are even some specific items that are found out in these places that you can talk to them about back at the Milano, providing even more lore and context. Speaking of the Milano, you actually do get to fly it and partake in a few dogfighting sections, and while this is a nice change of pace, unfortunately the controls kinda took me out of it. No, they're not terrible, but the main issue is that the controls feel unnatural. Your Y-axis, or how you go up and down, is not inverted like pretty much any other game with flight controls, so it is a little weird to get used to, but thankfully you can change the setting in the options. After years of playing games like Warhawk and Starhawk, it was a little disappointing to see how rather simplistic the controls were for the Milano, with the right stick pretty much automating every evasive action you can do with relative ease. I understand, however, that this is a Marvel game bound to have some mass appeal due to the license, so things like this are sacrificed for the sake of making the game more accessible to a casual audience. On the topic of accessible, however, the game also hosts quite a number of accessibility options. While these options aren't nearly as extensive as, say, some of the first-party ones we've seen in games like The Last of Us or even Spider-Man Miles Morales, the fact that we get some is pretty neat in and of itself. I do wish, however, that this game had at least some type of colorblind mode. This was a very heavily requested feature over in the Avengers subreddit that many who suffer from color blindness were pleading to have included in that game, so its omission here is not really a good look, especially when the majority of accessibility settings aren't really tuned for gamers with certain disabilities, but more about making the game easier, which is totally fine and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but more inclusion is never a bad thing, and it's something that I hope to see further developed should Square Enix and Marvel continue their partnership. Sound and art design are also top-notch here. From the views you get on board the Milano to the exotic locations of certain planets and their biomes, and even including enemies that are native to said planets, everything has a very distinct and unique look that makes it pop out. From Maklu 4 to Nowhere, no one environment ever really looks the same. I dare say that the only uninteresting locale throughout the entire game is probably the Nova Corps station sections, just because it feels like a lot of what we've already seen from other games that take place in space. Even the character models are really well done, my favorite of the bunch being Gamora. Also, shoutouts to Eidos Montreal. For a long time with the Deus Ex games, their biggest Achilles heel has been lip-syncing and animating conversations and making them look natural, and that is not a problem here. Whether it was in large part due to facial capture data and footage, or just the hard work of animators, the models in this game emote pretty darn realistically, and it's impressive, especially considering that you're also doing it for non-human faces as well. I can imagine animating Rocket's facial animations to his very expressive and explosive dialogue was quite the gargantuan task, and it's not going unnoticed by me. The same could also be said about the decision to have all the cutscenes be in-game this time around as opposed to pre-rendered cinematics like their past games, which has always looked off. Sound design is again really well done. Everything sounds about the way it should given the context of the game itself. Nothing really takes you out of it for sounding weird, like say Avengers when you first play as Thor and smack an enemy with your hammer, only for it to sound like someone taking an aluminum baseball bat and smacking a basketball with it. It doesn't really happen with this game at all, and the 80s soundtrack, like I mentioned earlier, that accompanies you throughout your journey with certain songs playing during certain sections for thematic purposes, or just casually as you converse with your team on the Milano, are really exquisite for what it's worth. There are a lot of bangers from Blue Oyster Cult to Twisted Sister, Tears for Fears, and so many more. I'm missing Daryl Hall and John Oates, unfortunately. I kinda wish they were here, man. They're the best. Even the fictional band Star-Lord, Peter Quill's favorite band and inspiration for his name in the game, have quite a few tracks that I actually genuinely enjoy. Zero to Hero is a legit good song, and it's entered my Spotify rotation. My biggest gripe with Guardians of the Galaxy, however, comes by way of its combat system. As I mentioned earlier, you can only play as Star-Lord in this game, with the other Guardians assisting you via command attacks per every member that once used are on cooldown for a short recharge period. As Star-Lord, your primary way of attack are your blasters, and that's pretty much it. While you do have your own specific command attacks and even some elemental shots with your blasters to weaken specific enemies, it still doesn't take away the fact that primarily your main weapon of engagement is always your blasters. You do have melee as an option, but it's not a really good one. Most enemies in this game counter your melee attacks, especially if you're just mashing and not paying attention, with a handful offering you the opportunity to counterpunch, but some just outright negate it, so as an option it's not really great unless you need to use it on an enemy really up close to you, if the game actually allows you to do it. Each member of the Guardians has 4 selectable attacks that you unlock as you progress through the game, each with different effects to them. The game functions as your standard action RPG, where after encounters you accumulate experience points, which can then be redeemed to unlock additional attack options, starting at 1 and again ending at 4 for each individual Guardian. Each Guardian also comes with unique traits to them, Groot being the healer, Rocket being demolitions and crowd control, and Gamora and Drax being damage dealers and staggerers. This leaves Peter Quill pretty much on the outside. The best way I can describe his playstyle in contrast to the others is that he's essentially a bard. And the game makes a reference to this at the very start, meaning that this was most definitely by design. He really doesn't do a whole lot of damage, isn't nearly as flashy as his contemporaries, but has the ability to rally the troops, command them, and give them damage buffs through huddle and song. And this is pretty cool, and it's neat charging up your team while battling to a random 80s tune. Pay attention to what your team is saying during the huddle though, because if you don't, you'll be the only one receiving any kind of buff, and yeah, like I said, Star-Lord is pretty underwhelming in comparison to the rest of the team, and that's not really an ideal situation when you're dealing with enemies in mass. This is where the issue with Star-Lord really starts to take heed. Because you're only playing a Star-Lord, Eidos really needed to give him an entire combat suite and then some to not have him feel completely useless, and while they somewhat managed to do that thanks in large part to his elemental blasters, he's still rather vanilla and boring. Again, you're just shooting for a large majority of this game, and even though as you progress you gain further options for Star-Lord, fundamentally, nothing really evolves past just shooting at things and commanding your teammates. Melee is not improved throughout the entire duration of the game at all. You have one upgrade that allows you to use your hover boots for a little while, which in all honesty shouldn't have even been an upgrade and should have been something that you're able to do passively in combat. You have a few select fire options with the blaster that are kind of clunky and not all that useful, especially given the pace of the game during its combat sections, and one rapid fire blaster shot that is actually pretty cool, but it keeps you stationary, so you'll be receiving a ton of hits depending on where you use it if you don't dodge out of it. Star-Lord's most useful attack is his grenade throw. Outside of that, you do have some other fledgling upgrades that you can acquire by finding salvage around the maps that can then be used by Rocket at workbench stations to further upgrade your quill, but these are very minor and don't add a whole lot of dimensions to an already basic combat system. In fact, even the way the game treats enemy engagements is very formulaic, and you can tell when you step into certain zones in the map when you're about to engage in a scuffle due to the wide open arena-styled level design that accompanies these sections. This doesn't really change despite the environments themselves doing so, and it's something that I got wind of very fast and honestly something that disappointed me. Given the track record of Eidos Montreal, level design is usually one of their strongest areas of design, and I was left a little underwhelmed by how they handled it here with the combat scenarios. On the flip side, however, during the exploration bits, you do actually use your fellow teammates' attributes to allow you to access to certain areas, which is a pretty ingenious way of harkening back to that team synergy feeling that the combat wants you to feel, but with exploration. Back to Star-Lord though, I think making Peter Quill a scrappy trapper in combination with his bard skills would be something interesting, using his words to taunt an enemy to annoy him and put him in a position for the rest of the Guardians to clean up with. Giving him a few gadgets as well as potential mines of varying effects would increase his combat versatility by a bunch without making the others feel redundant. I also do think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on the jet boots and a bit more options with the melee. Any game that gives you the opportunity to fly should really embrace that and not limit it. I get it's powerful, but power fantasy is part of superhero video games. And if there is a sequel narratively, you can have Quill pick up a few pointers from Gamora and Drax on hand-to-hand combat. I wish there was just more we could do with the jet boots though, outside of, slightly hovering around in combat and sliding around. Should there be another Guardians of the Galaxy game, this is an area of the game that I hope really gets a much focused look. It's not a terrible system, and it does need work, but given the length of the game, I feel a bit more depth is just needed. It tells you all that you need to know, though, that despite me not being completely enamored with the combat system, something that you do for a large chunk of this game, I'm still loving the experience with Guardians of the Galaxy. If you haven't played it or bought it, it's been permanently discounted to roughly about $40 with a free next-gen upgrade, and the development team should be proud because this is one hell of a ride. I've been saying this since forever, but don't sleep on Eidos Montreal. And I hope that this game reminds folks exactly who they are. I look forward to whatever game they make next, just please don't forget about a favorite cyborg guy.
Yeah, rip.